After more than 8 hours of deliberations, the African Union has decided not to throw its support behind the Libyan rebel administration. Why are they reluctant to recognize the NTC? How significant is the AU recognition? And what is Africa set to lose in post-Gaddafi Libya? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Shakunta Lasantharan. While the Libyan rebels announced their total control over the capital Tripoli, the African Union rejected calls for recognition of Libya's rebel National Transitional Council. The decision highlights Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi's lingering influence at the continental organization that he headed as recently as 2 years ago. 20 out of the 53 African Union nations have already said the council, backed by the rebels, is Libya's legitimate power. But South African President Jacob Zuma says the AU wants to see an end to the fighting before they can consider recognition of the NTC. From the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa, Nazanin Moshiri reports.
The speed of events in Tripoli has taken African leaders by surprise. While they've been talking about their own roadmap for peace, Gaddafi has disappeared and the NTC has declared itself as the only legitimate force in Libya. But the African Union moves at its own pace, refusing to recognise the NTC, insisting Libya must have an all-inclusive government. All tribes, even those loyal to Gaddafi, should be involved.
The NTC forces, as it were, are in the process of taking over Tripoli, and they've claimed that they've captured the city, but there's still a fighting going on in Libya. I think those are the facts. If there's a fighting, there's a fighting. So we can't therefore stand here and say this is a legitimate one now.
The South African president has been one of the strongest supporters of Colonel Gaddafi, leading 2 delegations to Libya during the fighting. But his roadmap for Libya was dismissed by the West and NATO. African nations may now feel sidelined. Their decision may also have something to do with Gaddafi's strong influence here, bankrolling the organisation, but also handing out massive donations to individual member states. It seems the African Union hasn't quite accepted Gaddafi is gone. One diplomat told me this was less about Gaddafi and more about the dangerous precedent that would be set if the NTC were to be legitimised. Whatever the reasons, for now at least, Libya's seat remains empty here at the African Union. Nazanin Moshiri, Al Jazeera, Addis Ababa.
Well, during the opening session of the AU Friday summit in Addis Ababa, the United Nations Deputy Secretary General Asha Rose Migiro addressed the AU leaders, urging them to recognize Libya's new political reality.
We must unite in helping Libya to build a sustainable peace and to make a smooth and inclusive transition to democracy. Together, we must encourage the new leadership to undertake every effort to protect civilians and public institutions, to maintain law and order, and to promote national reconciliation and unity.
Well, joining us now are our guests in Toronto, Miguna, former advisor to the Kenyan Prime Minister Raila Odinga. In London, Juma El Gamati, the NTC representative to the UK. And in Oxford, David Anderson, Professor of African Politics at the University of Oxford. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us. Well, despite the UN appeal to the AU, they still refuse to acknowledge the NTC. Miguna, why is that?
Well, there may be several reasons for that. If I understood President Zuma correctly, he did not flatly reject recognition. He said there is still fighting in Tripoli, and it would be difficult to recognize any faction because it's not clear who is actually in charge. I think they are in a very difficult position. On the one hand, Gaddafi was supporting African Union, has been the major benefactor of the African Union for many years. Secondly, on Zuma and South Africa specifically, Gaddafi is the one that supported the ANC and most liberation movements in Africa. So it would be very difficult to break that loyalty and link between Gaddafi and forces that have been connected to him, such as the ANC. On the other hand, you have to appreciate the fact that this NTC has not emerged as a force that you can recognize unilaterally, because they have not articulated what their positions are on many issues, including Pan-African issues. So I think it's a bit tenuous right now to be able to judge exactly why the AU has refused to recognize the NTC.
Jimma, what is the NTC's reaction to the African Union decision?
Well, first of all, you have to bear in mind that already over 20 African countries have unilaterally recognized the NTC as the legitimate government in Libya, including, ironically and interestingly, Chad, which obviously maybe have been trying to preemptive any backlash, knowing that Chad has been the largest source of mercenaries and has been a transit route for mercenaries to come into Libya and fight on Gaddafi's side and kill Libyans. So that is the first thing. The second thing is, you know, the whole idea of the African Union, we have to look at it in perspective. The African Union, as it stands today, is, as Gaddafi has always claimed, being the brainchild idea of Gaddafi himself. It was inserted back on the 9th of the 9th, 1999, 12 years ago. Gaddafi has always looked at the AU as his own baby, his own creation. Gaddafi has squandered billions and billions of Libyans' money trying to, let me be very blunt, trying to bribe many of the oppressive dictators, corrupt dictators in Africa to vote for him the way he wanted the African Union to go, and that is to move full ahead to create what he called the United States of Africa. And Gaddafi always had the grandiose idea that he will head that United States of Africa. Now, I'm not saying that all African leaders are corrupt. As we know, we respect a lot of democracies around Africa, countries like Senegal, Nigeria, South Africa and others, but we have to admit there are many, many corrupt dictators as well. And that is one of the sources of the problems, and that is partly what discredits the AU and doesn't really give it that much weighing, to be honest with you. As far as we're concerned, the Arab League has already recognized the NTC, the Organization of Islamic Countries is moving that way, the European Union, many, many major countries around the world. And if some African countries are feeling sorry for Gaddafi and want to hang on to the past, that's their problem. That's their right. But as far as we are concerned, it's up to them, not up to us. We are not really in a dire, we're not desperate. The main thing is our people, the Libyan people, are fully behind the NTC. We have won now. We have deposed this vile dictator, Gaddafi, the longest serving dictator in the world, 42 years. And we want to move on. We want to rebuild Libya along democracy, freedom, justice, transparency, and accountability. Okay. And if there are partners in Africa who believe in the same ideals and discourses, we will work very closely with them.
Right, Jimma. David, do you think the AU's decision is about the NTC's legitimacy, or is it about money?
I think it's about a mixture of issues, and I think both Miguna and Juma have highlighted some of the problems. Firstly, the AU is, as Juma's just reminded us, a relatively young organization, and Gaddafi was indeed involved in its birth. But it has matured enormously over the past few years, and it has become a much more sophisticated and effective regional organisation than it's ever been before. But I think this issue with Libya does cause dilemmas for the AU because of the Gaddafi influence. Now, the point was made that Gaddafi has supported many liberations in Africa, and that sense of liberation brotherhood is, in my opinion, one of the strongest political ideologies in the continent. And it's difficult for comrades who were supported by Gaddafi when the West was turning its back on them to now ditch him. So that does present a problem. But I can tell you, there are many bureaucrats in the AU in Addis Ababa now who are tearing their hair out at this decision with frustration, because they believe that although it's understandable why some would hesitate politically, this is a public relations disaster for the AU. It's not what they should be doing, because it allows the kind of criticisms that Juma has just made, that these are corrupt leaders simply voting to fill their own pockets and to support those who support them. And I don't think that's how the AU wishes to be seen any longer.
Okay, let's take a closer look at the financial dimension of this issue. Let's look at Libya's investments in Africa, all made while Gaddafi was in power. Libya holds billions of dollars in assets in Africa through subsidiaries of its $70 billion sovereign wealth fund. The money invested through the $5 billion Libya Arab Africa Investment Company. Libya is one of the leading regional shareholders in the African Development Bank. It has $300 million in capital in the bank with nearly 4% voting power. It's also one of the biggest contributors to the budget of the 53-country African Union. So Libyan investments in Africa total more than $8 billion and stretch sector and continent wide. Last year, Muammar Gaddafi also promised the continent $97 billion. Might these investments dry up without Gaddafi? And how much has this contributed to the AU's reluctance to recognize the NTC? Maguna.
I accept the argument that Libya is immensely invested in many African countries. In Kenya, where I come from, Libya is very, very deeply and heavily invested. But having said that, it is Libya and Libyan people who are heavily invested in Africa. It is not Gaddafi. The money and resources that were used for those investments were not personal resources of the strongman Gaddafi. So in some way, you cannot make the argument legitimately that because Gaddafi has been deposed, therefore the Libyan investments are in jeopardy. It depends on the kind of investment vehicles and investment arrangements that were made between the Libyan government and the African countries individually. So it is not really necessary to start worrying about the investments will evaporate because Gaddafi is not there. Having said that, I think we have to also draw in the argument that Juma was trying to make about the African dictators and the lack of proper governance structures in Africa in particular. I think a lot of countries, Uganda in particular, Ethiopia and some other countries, fear that with this Arab Spring, a lot of their citizens may be inclined to rise up. So I think it is less of the level of investment and more a political fear.
Juma, do you agree? Is it more political fear?
Partly, yes. Can I just mention something about the investment, by the way, just to add to the picture? We estimate that out of the $168 billion worth of assets outside Libya that the United Nations have asked for to be frozen, some $40 billion worth of investment and assets are in the continent of Africa. Now, unfortunately and regrettably, many African countries refuse to adhere to international legality and United Nations resolutions and refused to freeze these assets. In fact, some countries went even as far as nationalizing these assets and investments, which amounts to stealing Libyan people's money. That is the kind of problem we have because of lack of transparency, democracy, accountability, and because many of these African countries are ruled by sheer corrupt dictators who have been in Gaddafi's pockets for years and years. We have stories and we have evidence of Gaddafi's foreign minister going around African countries carrying cash in suitcases and paying it to these corrupt dictators just for them so that they vote the way Gaddafi wanted them to vote. You see, that's exactly the problem now we will have with Africa. And that's why I say many African countries need to show goodwill, need to decide, do they want to be in the past with Gaddafi or do they want to be in the present and the future with the Libyan people? That is a hard choice they have to make. And I agree that the Arab Spring, it's spreading, and once it spreads to more Arab countries, it is inevitable as international experts point out that it's going to spread to African countries as well, because, to be honest with you, one of the ills of Africa is lack of democracy, lack of freedom, lack of transparency, lack of accountability. Africa is a very, very rich continent, but its resources have been squandered. It's the poorest country. The standards, the development standards are well known around the world. They are always at the bottom. They are the worst. Africa could do a lot more, much more for proper sustainable human development. It can make huge leaps forward if it can get rid of these corrupt dictators.
I think Juma's comments on the use of the sovereign funds have already been supported by some evidence that's come out of Tripoli this morning, that Gaddafi was in fact using part of the sovereign funds for his own personal purposes, and it appears as if a significant proportion of the sovereign fund has in fact gone missing. So the concerns about personal interference with what is a national fund are well founded, as Juma says. But by the same token, I do hope that when the NTC sits down to think about its policy towards Africa, that it will take a more balanced view than Juma is just presenting to us. Because in fact, Libya supports the African Union not only because Gaddafi saw it as a personal mission, but because as one of Africa's 4 wealthiest countries, they are, I think, entitled to make a larger contribution. South Africa, Nigeria similarly make larger contributions because those are the countries that can afford it. And by making that contribution and by continuing to support the AU in a positive and constructive way, Libya's new government can in the future influence it in the ways that Juma is describing. However, if they publicly hector at African leaders and try to diminish their contribution, that role of positive constructive development will become much harder. So I hope that the new government in Libya will have maturity and sophistication enough to see that the AU can be its friend, not its enemy. And that's one reason why I think the decision by the AU this morning, it was unfortunate.
Miguna, does the AU trust... Go ahead, Juma, what were you saying?
Yeah, I appreciate what the gentleman from Oxford just said. However, you have to bear in mind that Gaddafi has squandered billions and billions in Africa. Investment of up to 40 billion is in Africa, while our country has been totally neglected with no infrastructure. We have poverty, we have no services. So everybody hopefully would understand that from now on we are going to take a bit of an inward looking. We are going to get our priorities right. We need to develop our country first before we think about developing Africa. And of course, yes, we want to invest, we want to influence Africa, but for the good reasons, for the right reasons. Unfortunately, Gaddafi put money in Africa for the wrong reasons, for his own grandiose ideas. We will want in the future to work with Africa and invest in Africa to promote democracy, freedom, transparency, accountability, and proper sustainable development. We will do that. But our priority now is to look inwards and take care of our own people, because they have been suffering badly under Gaddafi for 42 years. He has squandered our resources and left us poor with no infrastructure, no services, no development whatsoever.
Okay, Miguna, will the AU recognize a Libya without Gaddafi?
I think the AU should recognize Libya, the NTC, and the new Libyan administration without Gaddafi. My personal view is that Gaddafi overstayed is welcome. There is no one in the world that should be in power for more than 10 years. Gaddafi stayed for more than 40 years. Gaddafi took power before I was born, and I'm in my 40s. I think that is horrendous. I think that is the kind of thing that should never have happened. Those are the kind of things that we should be talking about. We should be talking about term limits. Even this NTC government should be a transitional authority that leads to free and fair elections so that the government and the society in Libya can be democratized. I don't think that we should just welcome them with euphoria without laying down the ground rules. The ground rules is not just that because they have deposed a dictator Therefore, they have a carte blanche. No, they shouldn't. So my view is this. AU should recognize the NTC, but as a transitional authority, and there should be a strict timeline and strict conditions on bringing Libya to democratic governance so that Libya can be welcomed in the society of civilized and democratic states.
Right. Juma, how important is it for Libya that the AU recognizes the NTC?
I think before we worry about the AU recognizing the NTC or recognizing the new political order in Libya, we look for the AU to do some PR exercises towards the Libyan people. We are going to need some explanations of why over the last 6 months the AU have kept silent and turned a blind eye to the mass murder that Gaddafi has been engaged in against the Libyan people. Over 20,000 civilians killed and over 60,000 has been injured. Mass rape, gang rape, and total destruction of cities and towns. Where was the AU over the last 6 months vis-a-vis these actions, these horrendous crimes, mass murder, international crimes the ICC has been talking about? The AU did not say anything, did not condemn these things. The AU officially sided with Gaddafi and always looked to give Gaddafi a way out and try to help him politically. I think that has damaged the reputation of the AU. The AU should be standing for human values, for the sanctity of human life, for the dignity of people, for freedom, for justice, for the right of people to live free, for the right of people to have aspirations. We did not see that officially from the AU. We saw it from certain countries, from many intellectuals in Africa, but not from the AU. So, we are not really desperate for the AU to recognize us so much as we are looking for the AU to do some PR and try to, get on the good side of the Libyan people and try to do some damage repair and damage limitation, and especially some countries who we have catalogued evidence, clear, strong evidence that their own citizens have been used by Gaddafi as mercenaries. This will come out. There will be many African nationals from different African countries who have been used by Gaddafi as mercenaries to kill us with our own money. Indeed, I'm not saying only African mercenaries. There are mercenaries from Europe, from Latin America, from different parts of the world. But the great majority came from African countries, unfortunately, and from, let me be very clear, from sub-Saharan African countries, unfortunately. That has to be addressed. That has to be addressed before we move on.
A question quickly to David first. Do you think Africa is going to lose out if it doesn't recognize Libya?
Yes, and I think Juma is quite right to say that this has been a PR disaster for the African Union. There is a very real danger that Libya will go back to the Arab League and leave the African Union altogether. And that, for Africa, would be a bad, bad step, because it would remove a potentially very positive influence from the African scene. And that would be, I think, a disaster. And if the African Union doesn't get its act together, that's where this is going to end.
Miguna, back to you. What were you going to say there? Sorry for interrupting.
I wanted to say this to Juma. The NTC more or less has taken power in Libya. They have to be careful not to be bogged down with the past of what the African Union did not do or did right. They have to look forward to a reconstructed democratic Libya. They have to not look back with anger at the African Union. They have to start engaging the African Union as a legitimate authority now in power in Libya. If you let this degenerate into NTC versus African Union, well, I can tell you the African Union is not going anywhere. I mean, it's there. Unfortunately for Africa, that is the continental body right now of heads of states and heads of government that come together to discuss things at the continental level. Libya happens to be in Africa. Libya happens to be in Africa and not the Middle East, geographically. So even though geopolitically and historically Libya has had its relations with the Arab world, Libya is not going to leave Africa and be situated elsewhere. So whether we like it or not, the Libyan authorities must have some engagement with Africa. That is inevitable.
On that note, we're going to have to end our discussion. Thank you very much to our guests in Toronto, Miguna, in London, Juma El Gamati, and in Oxford, David Anderson. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.